Welcome to the Manitoba Ag Days podcast, where we hear from some of the most relevant, up-to-date, informational speakers in our industry. In episode 34, Holly Dirksen, field crop pathologist at Manitoba Agriculture, shares her story, soybean canola rotation. Why not? A pathologist's perspective.
All right, so today I'm going to be talking about, Rajan came and asked me to speak about soybean canola rotation, obviously a hot topic as soybeans extend further west and north in Manitoba. An obvious fit into a rotation is with canola as well as wheat and other crops. So the question is there a disease issue we need to be worried about when it comes to these crops? So I'm going to start with my top 6 disease issues in soybean. Now these have been taken from the US and Ontario data, so they put out their top list of soybean diseases based on yield loss. So this isn't specific to Manitoba, but we can definitely interpret these results and think about what would be happening here. So number 6 in soybean, Septoria brown spot, a common foliar disease that we do see here, but not to economic levels. It's in every crop every year to some extent, but not at a point where we need to be spraying for it. The next is Phytophthora root rot, definitely an issue we have here in Manitoba, worse in some years than others, and definitely worse in those areas that have been growing soybeans for longer. Next, Sclerotinia stem rot, white mold, obviously a disease we're familiar with from other crops. Number 3 is sudden death syndrome, not one that we have found in Manitoba up to this point, but an issue in the US and Ontario. Second is seedling disease, Fusarium, Rhizoctonia, Pythium. Those are also the same diseases that can cause root rot as well. And number 1 in those places is soybean cyst nematode, which, as you may be aware, we also haven't found yet in Manitoba. We have been actively looking for it in the soils, but haven't found it yet. So from this list, those are the 4 that we do have in Manitoba at this point in time. Now, what about the top 6 disease issues in canola? So there isn't a developed list out there, so this is a list that I made up myself. I did talk to Barb Ziesman, who is my counterpart in Saskatchewan, and I also talked to Anne Brackenreed from the Canola Council. So if you don't agree with me, that's okay. You can tell me and we can think about altering this list because I just made it up for this presentation. But number 6, aster yellows, definitely something we can see here when the leafhopper populations are high and they are carrying this virus or phytoplasma. However, not an issue in the last number of years. We did have an issue about 5 or 6 years ago where it did hit us pretty hard. Hard to measure yield loss in canola, though, so it was hard to really say how much yield loss there was. Number 5, Alternaria pod spot, an issue that, especially if it's severe, you can have issues with shattering, so definitely can cause you some yield loss. Number 4, we put the root rots, foot rot, seedling disease in this category at number 4. So those, again, are your Fusarium, Rhizoctonia, Pythium pathogens. Number 3, I put blackleg. I feel like you know what the next 3 are going to be. But number 3, we put blackleg. Number 2, we put Sclerotinia. And number 1, we put clubroot. And that was just based on, in a severe year, the amount of yield loss that you can actually see. So we do feel clubroot, obviously in a very severe year, in a field that has no resistance and a lot of spores, you can basically see an entire wipeout of that crop. So at that level, we thought that would give it the rank of the most severe disease in canola. Sclerotinia, another one, if it's very severe, can cause pretty significant yield loss. Blackleg absolutely can cause yield loss, but not to the same level of Sclerotinia in a bad year. So those are my top 6 diseases issues in canola. The one I didn't mention on my list is verticillium wilt/stripe, obviously a newer disease in canola in Manitoba. We still don't really have a great grasp on how widespread it is, how severe it is, and if it's causing yield loss and to what extent. So didn't put it on the list at this point in time, but as we learn more about this disease, it might fit in there somewhere. So obviously our 2 major common denominators between soybean and canola, Sclerotinia stem rot/white mold, and the causal agents of those root rot seedling diseases being Fusarium species, Rhizoctonia species, and Pythium species. So I'm going to start with white mold. So looking at the life cycle of white mold. So we have, obviously, this is showing it in soybeans, but it's the same life cycle for both. So you have those sclerotia in the soil that overwinter. Then we look for those tiny mushrooms in the field when conditions get a bit wetter to see what the levels are like out there. However, you do not have to find those mushrooms. They're out there, even if you don't see them. So it's just basically a fun exercise to send your kids out looking for the right mushrooms. Those apothecia produce spores, and then they infect at the flowering stage for both canola and soybeans. A disease we're very familiar with, and then as the plant ripens, you have production of the sclerotia that return to the soil. Here you see in soybeans, they also mention this myceliogenic germination, so we don't see that as much in soybeans or canola, but in sunflower, that's definitely something that we see where you get that basal rot in sunflower. So what are the symptoms like in canola? We're all very familiar with them, I'm sure, but that you see that bleaching on the stem, and it starts to shred. The stem starts to shred as well and becomes very brittle. Obviously, you can see a lodging issue if you have quite a bit of sclerotinia. And then as the disease progresses, and if it's really humid, moist conditions, you actually see that white mycelial, that fuzzy growth on the surface of the infection. The symptoms in soybean, very similar. So here we have it underneath the canopy. So really fuzzy growth, just like we see in canola. It can be quite mushy in soybeans. This was a picture I took this year, and you can see that the coloration's a bit off, but this was a picture from Manitoba this year, even though we had a fairly dry year. This was an area that had a little bit more moisture, but more importantly, the seeding rate was too heavy in this field. And that's why they had this larger issue with sclerotinia, because the canopy was so dense and so thick. It was really able to trap all that moisture, and there was quite a bit of infection in that field. And this is from that same field, and you can see as the plant ripened, the stem breaks apart, and you can see those sclerotia within the stem. So the management in canola, know your risk. So the Canola Council puts out that risk assessment card. You can look at rotation, your previous disease levels, crop density, past rainfall, as well as the forecasted rainfall. Humidity obviously plays a role in that as well. And then your regional risk. In Manitoba, we're basically all high risk. So the regional risk often applies to more of the Saskatchewan and Alberta areas. But also scouting the conditions in crop stage, obviously very important. You need that moisture at flowering so that when the apothecia are present, they can release those spores and land on those petals. They need relative humidity and moisture for that, and you need for production of those mushrooms. But you also need moisture at petal drop. When those infected petals land on your stem axils and leaf axils, you need moisture at that point for the infection to go from the petals onto the stem. So conditions in crop stage, not just at flowering, but at petal drop as well. Fungicide application, canola growers are very aware of this, 20 to 50% bloom. And sclerotinia tolerant varieties, probably the newest management practice we have for canola, and they can be used as part of an IPM strategy. Definitely, you can't rely on this alone. They're just tolerant varieties, but in conjunction with these other practices, definitely an important part of managing sclerotinia and canola. Now, as far as management with soybeans, know your risk, obviously, is basically for any disease in any crop. Varietal selection can play a role with soybeans as far as plant stature. So obviously, a more upright plant will have more air movement underneath that canopy, and they'll be less susceptible to disease just because of the environmental conditions they're creating within the canopy. Row spacing can play a role. I think they talked about it a little bit on the panel, solid-seeded versus the more wider row spacing. Obviously, again, more air movement within that canopy, allowing for less conducive conditions for those mushrooms to form, basically. Fungicide applicants, there are fungicides that are registered for white mold in soybeans. Somewhat inconsistent performance. The timing is beginning of flowering to beginning of pod development. And it's not necessarily that the fungicides have an inconsistent performance, it's getting that right timing is what is inconsistent about the performance. So It's dependent on flower petal coverage, just like it is for canola, but obviously the flowers on a soybean plant are a lot harder to reach than the flowers on a canola plant. So it's about penetrating that canopy and covering those flowers before the crop canopy closes in. So what is the role of rotation in management? So we have some fact or fictions here. The first one is sclerotia, which I don't know about you, but I think this is like the most awesome picture I've ever found of sclerotia with the mushrooms sprouting right from it. Anyways, sclerotia, which are the overwintering structures, can survive in the soil for more than 5 years. Fact or fiction? Okay, fine. Answer, fact. There is, studies have shown differences relating to the burying depth, so with tillage, whether they're further down in the soil, if they survive longer versus on the surface. So whether tillage then later brings up those ones that have survived further, deeper in the soil, as well as environmental conditions, flooding, etc., can affect the mortality of these sclerotia. But generally speaking, even with harsh environmental conditions, or if they're laying on the surface, in Manitoba, we have more than enough sclerotia to go around. So even if we have some flooding that kills a percentage of the sclerotia, there's more than enough left to cause disease if the environment in the following year is conducive. So the next one, fact or fiction? Ascospores can travel several miles in the wind. Okay, but how about when I add this part to it? So it doesn't matter what my rotation is if the neighbors are growing susceptible crops. So the answer is, so this is what I found on it. It is difficult to find concrete, consistent evidence relating to that several miles that gets thrown out all the time, that they can travel several miles. But they definitely have a forcible discharge. They call it surfing their own wind, basically. So when they're released from those, and I kind of had that small picture now up in the corner, but I had it on the last slide, of the chuffing, they call when those ascospores are released. So they get forcibly discharged and travel up and catch the wind currents. There's no doubt about it. But effective transport of ascospores is under 40 meters. So, although what's happening on your neighbor's field can bring in a little bit of inoculum, it's mostly in your own field what you're concerned with. So is there a role of rotation in management of sclerotinia? Yes, definitely. For example, 2017, this past year, was dry. And I don't have the results of our canola disease survey up here, but we had sclerotinia in over 60%, I think almost 70% of our fields. I saw fields where sclerotinia was infected on more than half of the plants in the field with a fungicide application. So that just goes to show that even though it was dry, we had a good canopy cover, and what I think was going on is we had so much inoculum from 2016 near the surface, ready, those mushrooms were ready to form as soon as there was enough moisture because 2016 was such a bad year for sclerotinia. So I think that was part of why in 2017 we didn't see the levels, the low levels that we would expect, especially based on what we had seen in previous dry years because we had so much inoculum for 2016. So that's why I think that there is a role of rotation in management. Things to keep in mind. Canola is more susceptible to sclerotinia than soybeans. Allow yourself flexibility. If it's a bad sclerotinia year, consider a break from a susceptible host the following year. So I know people generally have their rotations more or less penciled out, for the next couple of years, but if it is a really bad sclerotinia year, keeping in mind that those sclerotia are probably going to be closest to the surface that next year, consider a break even if you had planned on soybeans the next year, for example. And that weed control is also important, especially in non-host years. There are many alternate hosts for sclerotinia, including many weeds, so keep that in mind as well. So moving on to root rot, multiple organisms cause root rot. So here I have a list of the 3 that are central to both canola and soybeans. So soybeans has Phytophthora as another one, which I didn't include on this list because soybeans is the only host for that Phytophthora root rot. So the 3 that are on both are the Fusarium species, the Pythium species, and Rhizoctonia solani. So you can see the optimal environments differ. Fusarium and Rhizoctonia both like warm, 20 to 27 degrees Celsius. Moist to wet is better for Rhizoctonia. Fusarium likes dry to moist soils, actually. So it does need moisture initially for infection to occur, but in fact, sometimes referred to as a dry root rot. So if it is a bit drier, it can be a worse year for Fusarium root rot. Pythium is an oomycete, so the spores swim in the soil, so that it needs to be wet soil for you to have a Pythium problem, but it does like a bit cooler temperatures, 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. And because I use this slide in many other presentations where I'm generally talking about one crop, I keep this host and alternate host for it, but as you can see, these are generalist pathogens. They will survive and infect pulses, cereals, as well as oil seeds. And now the overwintering structures is important as well. So I'll start at the bottom here. Rhizoctonia solani actually forms sclerotia as well, much smaller sclerotia than what we see with sclerotinia, so not as easily visible with the naked eye, but they are hard overwintering bodies. Pythium forms oospores, which also have a hard cell wall, so can overwinter well, and are hardy spores. Fusarium species, most of them form chlamydiospores, which also have a hard outer wall and can overwinter. There's a theme here, in case you hadn't noticed. The only one that doesn't form these that we know of is Fusarium graminearum, or the only one that we're concerned about really, which form the parathecia on infected stubble. Generally speaking, Fusarium graminearum we aren't as concerned about with root rots, but I will mention that again later. But again, I want to mention too that these pathogens are also part of the seedling disease complex. So I'm talking specifically about root rots today, but most of these pathogens also can infect that seedling disease and cause the seedling blight, the damping off, or the seed rot. So basically those issues when you don't have even emergence, or especially in issues when we have a cool spring, but a dry spring, so you go in early, but then the seed sits in the ground for a long time and that seed treatment wears off. That's often when we see those seedling issues, and they're due to these pathogens. So the symptoms in canola, here we have that pinching off right at the top of the root there, and then sometimes when you're pulling that out, you lose the root entirely and you just pinched off at the base of the stem. Can be easily confused with blackleg sometimes. And as well, just stunted plants, as well as drought symptoms. Obviously, if you're infecting the root system, you're infecting any uptake by the roots. So drought symptoms I include here, but also it can be nutrient deficiencies that you're seeing and you don't have a good explanation as to why, and it might be because your root system isn't as well formed because of a root disease. In soybean, here we have, I think this is Rhizoctonia showing up here, and this I believe is Fusarium. So Rhizoctonia does typically have a brick red coloration, but it is hard to distinguish these different root rots, so it is important to get a sample sent into the lab to figure out which root rot pathogen you're looking at. And again, stunted plants, drought symptoms. So really similar symptoms between both soybean and canola for the root rots. So this is my little additional thing as to why we see root rots worse in some years than others. So here we have a wet spring, and here's what we'll have, say, normal, adequate moisture spring. So if your plants develop in these two situations, you can see at a wet spring where you have a high water table, your plant doesn't develop as many roots to access that moisture. Whereas when it's a bit lower, they have a lot more roots out there to intercept the moisture, as well as also for any nutrient uptake. So as the root rot comes in, it takes out a certain portion of roots. And I have to say this happens basically every year. And every year the conditions are right for one of those root rots, basically. So at every year you probably have a bit of infection by a root rot. But obviously in this year it's taking out a larger portion of the roots than the other year. So if that water table drops, maybe you can even compare this to this past year. So we had a high water table in spring in 2017 and then a really dry growing season for most parts of the province. So that water table drops, now you have so much less root to start with to try and compensate for that loss. So that's why we saw a bigger issue with root rots in 2017 than maybe we'd seen in previous years, especially in soybeans. So management in canola and soybean. There's these general management practices that are what we recommend for seeding any year, but obviously not easily attained some years. So plant into well-drained soils, warm soils, minimize compaction, plant at appropriate seeding depth. I don't even feel like I want to mention these as management practices because obviously we would love to do all these things every year, but it's not always possible. Protect against other disease and insect issues. Often if you have something else moving in, it can either provide a site for that infection to occur, for example, with something like a rootworm, but also just an added stress on the plant makes it more susceptible to disease. And then there are fungicidal seed treatments that give you protection during that seedling stage, so 2 to 3 weeks of protection. So the important is to get your crop off to a good start so that you can utilize that protection while you're still in the seedling stage, but then once they're past that seedling stage, it's okay if the fungicide isn't there acting anymore because they're able to fend for themselves a bit better. And that's also another point where it's important to know what causal agent you've seen in previous years. So if you're planting into a field where you've had root rot in the past, you say, I'm going to use a seed treatment, but do you know what root rot you were seeing in those other years, especially with soybeans, for example? So was it Fusarium? Was it Phytophthora? There might be a selection of the product or the rate that you use based on that information. The main problem I have found when I was putting together this presentation on soybeans and canola in rotation together is a lack of research. So it turns out not a lot of places grow both soybean and canola. It's basically us, North Dakota. It's starting to stretch further south, but as you stretch further south, it ends up being canola is the new crop, and canola is being introduced into the rotation. So in a lot of cases, the recommendation in those places is don't introduce canola into the rotation the year before soybeans because canola is more susceptible to sclerotinia. So that's a different concept than what we're looking at here. We have so much sclerotinia inoculum that's not a huge issue as to when we introduce it, but at the same time, what happens when you're introducing soybeans into rotation? Not a lot of information out there. So looking at the yield data from MASC, there's no glaring issues with soybean and canola rotation or vice versa. On the average, I think one of them is 100%, one of them is 103. So average yields based on that rotation information. So I did find 2 studies in total that I'm going to go through, and the first was one from North Dakota State University, and they were comparing yield of soybean canola versus wheat canola, and canola soybean versus wheat soybean. And they looked at different parameters: density, height, yield, test weight, and oil content. And then they had 4 locations and 2 years of data. So the significant differences were few, and I've listed them all there, but those top 2 relate to yield. So in one of the years, in 2015, in Roseau, the canola yield was higher after soybeans than after wheat. So they saw a higher yield when they grew canola after soybeans. And then there was one year where they saw same thing. So 2016 in Roseau, the soybean yield was higher after canola than after wheat. So those are the only 2 instances that they saw. So that was out of 8 site years of data that they saw significant differences. But both times it was a yield bump. And then this is other things that they saw. So there was soybean test weight that was slightly higher after wheat than after canola. There was a year where the soybean height after wheat was higher than after canola. And then there was a year in Minot where canola oil content was higher after wheat than after soybean. And then they saw the same thing in 2015 in Roseau. So this is the really lack of information I'm finding out there, basically. There was a University of Manitoba study that's been funded by the pulse growers. There's a postdoctoral researcher with Dr. Fouad Deyef. His name is Ahmed Abdelmajid, and he generously gave me some of his slides to show. But he's looking at the effects of different rotation regimes on soybean disease in 3 locations in Manitoba, continuous soybean, canola soybean, corn soybean, and wheat canola corn soybean. So it's 4-year rotation study, so obviously it's canola soybean, so on and so forth. So these are his 3 locations, are Melita, Carmen, and Kelburn, and I've just combined his data all into one slide. But basically he saw the same trend at each location to different severities. So this is looking specifically at root rots. At every location, growing continuous soybean gave the highest level of root rot severity. A canola soybean came in second and was significantly higher than a corn soybean or the 4-year rotation. So definitely seeing an effect of a 2-year rotation, and specifically with soybean versus corn, or pardon me, canola versus corn, and the soybean root rot severity. So as you can see, there were location differences where they did see more disease in Melita than Carmen and Calburn, but overall the same trend showed up. But there's no issues with wheat, right? Like, that's the big question. It's okay to have wheat in there, that's my good break crop, no big deal. Well, it turns out that Fusarium graminearum can infect soybean roots, which was not really previously thought to be an issue at all. And it's still, and this is again from the U of M study, so he isolated which Fusarium species were causing the root rots in soybeans, and only 3% came back as Fusarium graminearum, but it wasn't expected that they were going to isolate any Fusarium graminearum. And of course, Fusarium graminearum is our main Fusarium head blight pathogen. So that just brings in one more disease cycle for you to look at, and that's the Fusarium head blight disease cycle. So if I just zoom in on this part over here, it'll be a little unclear, but infection of pulses, oil seeds, and others can increase your inoculum. So it's less of a concern, I would say, as far as Fusarium head blight and a bad year Fusarium head blight following with a soybean crop, whether you're going to have more severe root rot. But more of a concern is maybe that root rot is adding a little bit more Fusarium graminearum, like we needed it, into our soils to cause infection for Fusarium head blight. So something to think about, and something that they'll definitely be monitoring over time to see if it becomes more aggressive in infecting soybeans or not. So what is the optimum rotation? Well, I'm not going to give you that answer, sorry. It's grower dependent, obviously weighing risk and rewards, and obviously depending on the amount of crops you're willing to put into your rotation. And disease is only one part of the complex puzzle, I'm sure you're aware. Weeds, whether it's through weed resistance, volunteers, fertility, soil health, economics, etc. So this is where I plug Anastasia's talk. So Anastasia Kubanek, who also works out of our Carmen office and happens to be my manager, but that's not why I'm plugging her talk. But at 2:30 today, she's giving a talk specifically on all the aspects of crop rotation, slippery slope, or economic opportunities. So I definitely suggest, if you're interested in this topic, to go to her talk at 2:30 in this room as well. And that's what I have. And I've had a few requests from people that couldn't be here that would maybe want these slides, so they can tell them to email me or give me a call, and I can email this presentation to them. There's something that Roberta wants me to plug. Oh, Canola is now featuring Soy Lab, so perfect transition from my presentation. So this year, Canola in Brandon and Dauphin, March 14th in Brandon and March 15th in Dauphin, and there will be soybean-specific presentations and slots at Canola this year. So Canola now featuring Soy Lab. Register.
Very good. Please join me with thanking Holly for this presentation. And then I'll allow one question. Do we have a question from the audience on this particular topic before we transition to the next?
Oh, there's Jason.
Yes, go ahead.
So the question is whether there was any consistency, whether there was a reduction in yield growing soybeans after canola. Not that I saw. But those are two, really low site year studies. So there definitely more research that needs to be done.
Thanks for tuning in to the Manitoba Ag Days podcast. We'll see you next year from January 22nd to 24th, 2019.